On the morning of April 22, 1887, a coffin maker in Pittsburgh had no idea that 300 miles away, in a brownstone on East 51st Street in Manhattan, the richest man he had ever built a rail car for was getting married. Neither did the newspapers. Neither did most of Andrew Carnegie's own employees. 30 people knew. No best man stood beside him. No maid of honor stood beside her. There was no announcement in the society pages the next day, because there was no announcement at all. Andrew Carnegie was 51 years old. He controlled more steel than any man alive, more than entire nations, more than would be believable if you said the number out loud. And on the day he finally married the woman he had loved for 7 years, he did it like a man hiding something. He was. To understand what he was hiding, you have to go back further than the wedding. You have to go back to a woman most people watching this have never heard of. A woman who was never on a stock certificate or a library cornerstone, but who ran Andrew Carnegie's life for 45 years, with a grip so complete that his own bride had to wait a decade for a wedding date. Her name was Margaret Carnegie. She was his mother, and she is the reason this story isn't really about steel at all. Here is what most biographies of Andrew Carnegie leave as a footnote. On New Year's Day, 1880, at a family gathering in New York, a 22-year-old woman named Louise Whitfield was introduced to a 44-year-old bachelor industrialist. He was already one of the wealthiest men in America. He had already built the empire that would become Carnegie Steel. He had already, by his own account, decided he would never marry while his mother was alive. Louise didn't know that last part yet. Neither did he say it to her face. He simply let the years pass, one after another, while she waited. They rode horses together in Central Park. They talked about poetry and religion and the future. Louise wrote in her diary that their rides together were glorious, one word, underlined. By 1883, 3 years after they met, they were secretly engaged. Not quietly engaged. Secretly. Nobody in either family was told, because Andrew Carnegie's mother would not have allowed it, and Andrew Carnegie, a man who negotiated with railroad barons and broke national unions, could not bring himself to tell her. Margaret Carnegie was 70 years old by then. She had raised Andrew in poverty in Scotland, crossed the Atlantic with him as a child, worked as a shoebinder to keep the family fed while his father struggled to find steady work in the New World. She had bet everything on her son, and he had paid the debt back 1,000 times over. They shared a suite at the Windsor Hotel in New York. She went with him to business meetings. When he travelled to Scotland to visit his childhood home in Dunfermline, she came too, and by most accounts, she made sure Louise did not. There's a detail from that period that tells you almost everything you need to know about this marriage before it even happened. In 1881, Carnegie invited Louise to join him and his mother on a trip back to Scotland. His mother intervened. Louise stayed home. Margaret went instead, and paraded through the streets of Dunfermline in a carriage in front of the townspeople, who remembered her leaving decades earlier as a poor, humiliated woman with nothing. She had come back a queen, and she had made sure the only person riding beside her son was herself. If you are picturing a domineering mother from a Victorian melodrama, hold that thought, because the real story is stranger. Some who wrote about the family later said Margaret had extracted an actual promise from her son, that he would remain unmarried as long as she lived. Whether it was a literal vow or simply an understanding, neither of them ever needed to say aloud. The result was the same. Andrew Carnegie, who could force Henry Clay Frick into a business partnership on his terms, who could crush a labor union with a telegram from another continent, would not defy his mother on this one point. For 4 years after the secret engagement began, the wedding date simply did not exist. At one point, the strain became too much. Louise, exhausted by watching her own 20s disappear into an arrangement nobody outside 2 people knew existed, called off the engagement. This wasn't a quiet pause. It was an ending, or it was supposed to be one. And then, after nearly a year apart, they started writing to each other again. They renewed the engagement, still in secret, still with no date. Louise had made her choice, and her choice was to keep waiting for a man who would not choose her over his mother, because some part of her understood something the rest of us are about to watch play out, that this was never really a competition. Louise wasn't trying to win against Margaret Carnegie. She was trying to outlast her. She did, but not the way anyone would have wanted. In the fall of 1886, Andrew Carnegie was staying in Cresson, Pennsylvania, when he came down with typhoid fever. 9 days later, his younger brother Tom, who had been ill with pneumonia, died at the age of 43, leaving behind a wife and 9 children. Andrew was too sick to be told. His fever kept spiking. His mother, already elderly and now grieving a son she had just buried, held together for 3 more weeks before her own body gave out. She died of pneumonia on November 11, 1886, at 76 years old. Andrew Carnegie did not find out his mother was dead for almost 3 weeks after it happened. The people around him, fearing what the news would do to a man already fighting for his life, kept it from him, to make sure he wouldn't hear commotion in the house, or see a hearse, or notice anything at all. His mother's coffin was lowered out of a 2nd-story bedroom window, instead of carried down the stairs and out the front door, so that the one man in the world who had organized his entire existence around her would not wake up and understand what had happened before he was strong enough to survive knowing it. Sit with that for a second. The most powerful industrialist in the United States, a man who could summon governors and senators, was lied to for weeks about his own mother's death because the people who loved him didn't trust his body to survive the truth. And once he was strong enough to be told, he still didn't rush toward the life he had supposedly been waiting for. He wrote to Louise that it would not seem in good taste to announce their engagement so soon after his mother's death. Even in grief, even with the one obstacle to his marriage finally gone, his first instinct was still about how it would look. They married 5 months later, in that small brownstone wedding, with 30 guests and no fanfare, on April 22nd, 1887. Louise wore a grey wool travelling suit, not a wedding gown, something practical enough to double as an outfit for the honeymoon that would follow. It was, by every account left behind, understated to the point of looking like an ordinary Tuesday. As a wedding gift, Carnegie gave his new wife an annual income of $20,000 and a house on West 51st Street that had once belonged to another industrialist. He did not give her, and would not give her for years, the one thing she had spent a decade of her life waiting for, a husband who put her first. Because 5 years into the marriage, with his mother 2 years in the ground, Andrew Carnegie left the country again. This time it wasn't to visit his mother's hometown. It was his regular summer trip to Scotland, the trip he took nearly every year like clockwork, and he left in April of 1892, right as tension was building at one of his steel plants outside Pittsburgh, a town called Homestead. He left the negotiations, the wage cuts, the looming confrontation with the union, in the hands of his partner Henry Clay Frick, and then he made himself unreachable. What happened next is the part of Andrew Carnegie's story most people already half know. Frick locked the workers out. He built a barbed wire fence around the plant that the workers started calling Fort Frick. On July 6, 300 Pinkerton guards came up the river on barges in the dark to retake the mill, and a gun battle broke out that left at least 10 men dead. It became one of the bloodiest labor conflicts in American history, and the man whose name was on the company, the man who had spent years publicly claiming to support workers' right to organize, was an ocean away at a castle in Scotland, staying, in the words of reporters who tried and failed to reach him, inaccessible. Louise was with him. She had been his wife for 5 years by then, and while the country back home was watching men die outside a steel mill that bore her husband's name, the two of them were in the Scottish Highlands, distant from the violence in every sense of the word. Carnegie later said, "The massacre wounded him more deeply than anything else in his life, that it was so unnecessary." He said it in letters, in private, to people who already loved him. He never said it to the men who lost their jobs, or the families of the men who lost their lives. He let Frick take the public blame, and stayed exactly as silent about Homestead as he had been about his own engagement for 7 years. And the pattern by now should be starting to feel less like coincidence and more like a personality. There's one more piece of the Homestead story worth sitting with before we move on, because it shows exactly how Andrew Carnegie processed the difference between guilt and responsibility. After the strike ended, after the union was broken and the plant reopened with strikebreakers and some of the state's first black steelworkers filling the jobs of the men who had been fired, Carnegie wrote privately that nothing in his entire life, before or since, had wounded him as deeply, that it had all been so unnecessary. He wrote that to people who already cared about him. He never once said it publicly, never apologized to a widow, never stood in front of the workers whose union he had spent years praising and then let his partner destroy. The wound was real. It just stayed exactly where his mother's death had once stayed, locked inside him, known only to the people closest enough to be trusted with it, while the world outside was left to work out the rest from a distance. That is the marriage you are about to hear the full story of. Not a fairy tale about a poor Scottish boy who built an empire and found love. A marriage that survived a decade of secrecy, a mother who would not let go, a death concealed by lowering a coffin out of a window, and a husband who fled to another continent, both when his mother wanted him close and when his own workers needed him to speak. Louise Whitfield waited 7 years to become Mrs. Andrew Carnegie. What she actually got, once she finally had him, is the part almost nobody talks about. And it starts, strangely enough, with the happiest years either of them ever had. Before we get into that, if this kind of story is the reason you're here, the kind where the marriage certificate is the least interesting part of the marriage, subscribe now so the rest of this series lands in front of you. There's a lot more where this came from. Now, back to 1887, and the wife who finally got her husband, only to learn what kind of husband a decade of waiting had made him. Before any of the grief, before the secrecy, there was simply a young woman who noticed a man everyone else in New York already knew by reputation. Louise Whitfield grew up on East 18th Street near Gramercy Park, the daughter of a merchant father and a mother who was often unwell. She had, by her own description, a happy childhood, sheltered but not stifling, the kind of upbringing that produced women who knew exactly how to run a household and rarely got the chance to run anything larger. Her own mother needed constant medical attention, and Louise, like Carnegie with his mother, grew up organizing her life around someone else's fragility. That's worth remembering, because it means the two people who fell in love on those horseback rides in Central Park had both spent their entire adult lives putting a parent first. The difference is that Louise's mother, unlike Margaret Carnegie, encouraged the relationship instead of trying to strangle it in its crib. Carnegie was already a myth by 1880. Born poor in Dunfermline, Scotland, shipped to America as a child, he had worked his way from a bobbin boy in a cotton mill to a telegraph messenger, to a railroad executive, to the man who would eventually consolidate the American steel industry into an empire worth, in today's terms, hundreds of billions of dollars. He was one of the most eligible bachelors in the country, and according to people who knew the family, he had been introduced to plenty of women over the years. All of them ended the same way. His mother decided none of them were good enough for her son. Louise was different, and not because she fought Margaret Carnegie for territory. She didn't. For most of the decade, she simply waited in a kind of dignified suspension, riding with Andrew, corresponding with him, watching him choose his mother again and again, and staying anyway. It would be easy, looking back with modern eyes, to call that weakness. It wasn't. It was a specific kind of patience that assumes the story isn't finished yet, and in this case, she was right, even if the ending cost more than she expected. There's also a detail about Louise's own household that rarely makes it into the story, and it explains a lot about why she was able to wait as long as she did. Her father, John Whitfield, was a moderately successful New York merchant, not a man of Carnegie's stature, but comfortable. He died in 1878, 2 years before Louise met Andrew, leaving her mother in a fragile position, both financially and physically. Louise had already spent her early 20s as a caretaker rather than a debutante, managing a household around a sick mother instead of touring Europe or chasing suitors the way women of her class were expected to. By the time Andrew Carnegie came into her life, she wasn't a young woman dazzled by a rich bachelor. She was a young woman who already understood, from years of practice, what it meant to arrange your entire life around someone else's needs and call it normal. That shared instinct is probably what let the relationship survive as long as it did, without either of them naming what was actually happening. Andrew never told Louise, in plain language, that his mother had extracted a promise from him. Louise never demanded he choose. Both of them operated for years inside an arrangement built on things left unsaid, which meant the marriage that eventually followed was never going to be built any other way. You don't spend a decade practicing silence and then discover, on your wedding day, that you suddenly know how to talk about hard things out loud. When the wedding finally happened in 1887, Louise didn't get the version of Andrew Carnegie that history remembers. The philanthropist writing checks for thousands of libraries, the elder statesman handing out reading rooms to towns across 3 countries. She got a 51-year-old man who had spent his entire adult life organizing his time around business and a mother, and who now had to learn, at an age when most men's habits are permanent, how to organize it around a wife instead. By most accounts, he did learn, and the marriage that followed the wedding was genuinely close. They read aloud to each other in the evenings. He inscribed a copy of Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia to her during their honeymoon, telling her she had turned the earth into a heaven for him, one of the only openly sentimental lines the notoriously guarded Carnegie ever put on paper. They bought Skibo Castle in the Scottish Highlands and rebuilt it into a summer estate, where Carnegie entertained scientists, writers, and presidents every year, with Louise running a household of guests that most hostesses would have found impossible to manage. But the habits of silence don't disappear just because the man finally got married. Homestead happened 5 years into the marriage. Carnegie's instinct, when the thing he cared about most was under threat, whether that thing was his mother's approval or his company's reputation, was always the same. Leave the country, say nothing publicly, let someone else absorb the consequences, and privately tell the people closest to him how much it hurt. Louise watched that instinct play out in the summer of 1892 from the safety of a Scottish castle while men died 7,000 kilometers away in Pennsylvania. Skibo itself deserves a moment, because it says something about what Louise had actually signed up for. Carnegie bought the estate in the Scottish Highlands in 1897 and spent years rebuilding it into a castle with its own pipe organ, its own golf course, and guest lists that could include a sitting president one summer and a Nobel laureate the next. Louise was the one who ran it. Every letter, every dinner seating chart, every argument between a difficult guest and a difficult husband passed through her first. She had married a man who could no longer separate his private life from his public one, and Skibo became the place where those 2 lives were forced to share a roof, with Louise as the only person capable of keeping the roof from collapsing. It would be 10 more years after the wedding before the marriage got the one thing it had been missing since the day it started. In 1897, when Louise was 40 and Carnegie was 61, she gave birth to their only child, a daughter named Margaret, after the mother-in-law Louise had never been allowed to properly meet as a friend. Whether that was a peace offering, an act of forgiveness, or simply the family name repeating itself the way names do, nobody recorded. What is recorded is that Carnegie, in his 60s, doted on his daughter in a way he had never publicly doted on anyone, the late arrival of a man who had spent 30 years being the most important person in his own story, finally discovering he wasn't. Louise, for her part, seems to have used motherhood the way she used everything else in this marriage, quietly and on her own terms. She encouraged Margaret's independence in a way nobody had ever encouraged hers, writing to her daughter from a houseboat trip in the Everglades in 1916 to make sure Margaret went to her debutante events without her, rather than waiting on a parent the way Louise herself had once waited on Andrew. By 1916, Louise hosted Margaret's coming-out party for 800 guests at their home on 91st Street, the kind of lavish, public, unmissable event that stood in almost comic contrast to her own 30-guest wedding 30 years earlier. It's hard not to read that as intentional. The daughter got the entrance into society the mother never had. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel goes deeper into these marriages than the headlines ever do. Hit like now so more people see it, and drop a comment telling us which old money marriage you want covered next. It genuinely shapes what we make. Andrew Carnegie sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars today, becoming, for a stretch, the richest private individual on the planet. He spent the last 2 decades of his life giving nearly all of it away, funding more than 2,500 libraries, endowing universities, and writing the essay that made his name synonymous with the idea that the wealthy have an obligation to spend their fortunes before they die, rather than pass them down untouched. Louise ran their households, in New York and at Skibo, and by every account became the one person capable of managing a man who had spent his whole life being unmanageable. She softened him in ways his mother never had reason to. She also, quietly, kept doing what she had always done, absorbing the parts of him that never fully changed. He remained a man who preferred distance to confrontation, who could write pages about the moral duty of the wealthy, while staying silent about the specific workers who built his fortune, who found it easier to feel guilt in a letter than to say it out loud to the person who deserved to hear it. The giving itself followed the same rhythm as everything else in his life. It was enormous, it was public, and it was almost entirely his to direct. Louise supported it, hosted the people it required her to host, and by most accounts never once tried to steer it. She had spent a decade learning that Andrew Carnegie made his own decisions in his own time, and marriage hadn't changed the lesson, it had just given her a closer seat to watch it from. Where she did leave a mark was smaller and more personal. Friends and staff described her as the one person who could soften a room Carnegie had just walked into with his usual bluntness, the one who remembered the names of people he had forgotten, the one who wrote the thank you notes his fame made him too busy to write himself. Carnegie died in 1919, at 83, at their Massachusetts summer home, with Louise beside him. Their daughter Margaret had been married that same April, on the couple's own 32nd wedding anniversary, at the family mansion, with Carnegie present as an invalid for what would be one of the last events of his life. He had gotten, in the end, exactly what his mother never gave him room for: a wife who stayed, a daughter who carried his name forward, and a death surrounded by the family he had spent 7 secret years refusing to build. Louise Whitfield Carnegie lived another 27 years after her husband died, into 1946, long enough to watch her grandchildren grow up, long enough to become the last living link to a marriage that had started with a mother's veto and ended with a private, unremarkable death in a house that reporters never once got close to. She outlived every person who could have told the story of those 7 secret years from the inside, and she chose, like her husband before her, not to tell it herself. What survives comes from diaries, letters, and the kind of family records nobody expected strangers to read a century later, which is its own quiet irony. A marriage built on withheld information ended up being reconstructed almost entirely from the small pieces its two participants never meant to leave behind. It is worth asking what Louise actually got out of all of it, because the honest answer isn't a simple one. She got wealth beyond almost anyone else's imagining, a title as one of the most respected philanthropic hostesses in the country, a daughter she clearly adored, and 27 years of widowhood spent managing the Carnegie name and its causes with the same steadiness she had once used to manage a decade of waiting. She also got a husband who, even after everything, never fully learned to speak the hardest truths out loud to the people who needed to hear them, not to his workers, and by some accounts, not always to her either. The steal made Andrew Carnegie famous. The silence is what actually built the marriage, layer by layer, long before the wedding, and it never entirely stopped shaping it after. There is a version of this story that gets told as a love story, and in its own guarded way, it was one. But the truer version is about what a person learns to accept when the alternative is losing someone entirely. Louise Whitfield spent a decade waiting for a man who would not choose her over his mother, married him only after that mother's death made the choice unnecessary, and then spent the rest of her life married to a man whose deepest instinct, in a crisis, was still to go quiet and go far away. She got the marriage. She never fully got the man out from under his mother's shadow, because some part of Andrew Carnegie never left that room in Cresson where he lay sick for 3 weeks, not knowing his mother was already gone. If this is the kind of history you come back for, the marriages behind the mansions, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're going into another one of these old money houses where the silence lasted even longer than this one did. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.